ability to share knowledge virtually and instantaneously. The internet is now the single greatest aggregation, storage, and means of dissemination of knowledge in the world. However, this rapid expansion and sharing of knowledge through digital technologies and the promise it holds to improve the human condition may not be evenly and universally realized, as more than half of the people in the world do not have reliable access to the internet, and many have no access to the internet at all. For many developing countries, the COVID-19 pandemic accelerated the pace of adoption of digital technologies in everyday life. Countries migrated their education system to online learning. Access to many other social services were virtualized, and a significant part of our labor force worked virtually from home. The pandemic demonstrated the efficiency and convenience of online systems. But more importantly, it highlighted the internet as a critical, national, global infrastructure for economic and social resilience. Segments of our populations without robust internet access would have suffered disproportionately from learning loss, loss of income, and lack of access to some services. Beyond this first level divide, which is based primarily on access to the internet, the rapid advancement of technologies in the fourth industrial revolution is creating a second order of divide, which is along the lines of human resource capacity and skills to create and apply digital technology to economic growth and sustainable development. Many in our societies are not digitally native or digitally literate. I certainly try to consider myself a digital native. But when I see what my sons are doing, I realize that I'm from a whole different generation. But such it is for many people in our populations. They are not instantly taken and absorbing technology. But for many in the developing world, we are only consumers of technology. We are only utilizing the benefits of technology as appliances. For the developing world, we need to start seeing ourselves as the originators and creators of technology. We need to start seeing ourselves as the innovators of technology and using technology to create economic value. The internet and digital technologies are critical drivers of wealth creation and prosperity in our society. Governments must be deliberate in ensuring that this public good is equitably accessible to all citizens. Otherwise, it could come to define a new dimension of poverty, that of knowledge poverty. To bridge the divide, Jamaica has accelerated the build-out of its national broadband backbone to facilitate the rollout of high-speed internet across the island. Through our Universal Service Fund, we are also providing free internet access points in major town centers, public spaces, parks, and other community areas. The Jamaican government is also actively developing the human resource capacity in ICT. In collaboration with the private sector and international partners, we recently launched a coding academy and started the process of mainstreaming coding in the public school system. Despite this effort, however, the lack of technical skills remains prevalent and is immediately a constraint on our economic development. This stands true in other Commonwealth countries, making the need to equip our population with the requisite digital skills an increasingly critical priority. The Commonwealth is built on shared values and supported historically and culturally and institutionally, and has played an integral role in the development of each member state. Within this family of nations, we have countries at various stages of digital development and maturity, including some that are on the cutting edge of technology. One of the priorities of the Commonwealth must be to support and accelerate the digital development of all members, particularly in areas of governance and regulation. Each country within the Commonwealth must place significant emphasis on improving its telecommunications and ICT sectors and design bolder plans to digitize services and promote greater digital inclusion in partnership with our private sectors and innovators. Eliminating digital inequality must have at its core gender equality, the goal of which is to maximize social inclusion by enhancing the participation of women and girls in all areas of development and supporting women's entrepreneurship in digital business and work. Digital technologies also provide an attractive avenue for boys and young men who have been left out of the formal education system and have become drawn into antisocial behavior. We must push for STEM programs in our schools that provide the necessary support for the next generation of designers, coders, and software developers. As part of this process of inclusion, keen attention must be paid to the need and concerns for persons with disabilities in accessing and using digital technology. As a small island developing state within the Commonwealth Caribbean, Jamaica is affected by the vagaries of the Atlantic hurricane season, and we must use our digital technology to collect as much data about our climate and environment as is possible, to create climate risk assessment tools and instruments that provide us with a fighting chance against climate change. It is evident that the way forward for middle-income Commonwealth states will require even greater investment in research and innovation to build digital capacity and to ensure that we are empowered, enabled, and indeed repositioned to manage shocks and take advantage of opportunities. The Commonwealth is reported to be home to 12% of the world's researchers and accounts for around 10% of global research and development expenditure. We therefore have within our grouping a critical threshold of resources to meaningfully support and accelerate the digital development of our members through improving our regulatory framework and supporting foundational systems such as digital identity, expanding the capacities and readiness of our human resources in ICT, developing instrumental strategies for inclusion of the vulnerable and marginalized in our societies, and expanding investments in building out the digital infrastructure and economies. The increasing capacity of information and communication technologies, analytics, and innovation gives rise to new opportunities every day. This is indeed a wonderful time to be alive, to see the emergence almost daily of new technologies which raises new possibilities of uplifting mankind, of making life better for us all, of addressing the large issues which confront us, of climate change, of poverty, of overcoming diseases and other threats. But mankind has been at this juncture of technology before. How have we managed it so that it was actually beneficial to all, so that its benefit was equitably spread? I believe now that we have not just the technology to make life better, but we now have the understanding of governance. And we now have the understanding of the importance of equity in how resources are distributed, not just on the national level, but globally as well. Within this forum, we have the capacity to ensure that the promise that ICT and other technologies hold for the upliftment of mankind is actually realized and the benefit is actually secured for all our people. I urge us all to work together in partnership, government, to harness the technologies that are available, the innovation, the ingenuity of our people, to close the digital divide. The great promise of ICT technologies is the democratization of knowledge, the spread of knowledge. That is the great promise. And I believe that we can, as a Commonwealth, but generally as global peoples, ensure that we all benefit from the promise that ICT and digital technologies hold to build a sustainable and prosperous future for all. I thank you.
Hardy Pemiwa, who's the President and CEO of Cassava Technologies. Dr. Valentine Obi, the founder and group CEO of Transact Global. Give him a hand. Mr. Thomas Lamanauskas, who's the managing partner of Envision Associates. And lastly, Mr. Jonas Maru, the founder and managing director of Bandwidth and Cloud Services Group. Thank you, everyone. So our topic today is on bridging the digital divide. I think the Right Honorable Prime Minister gave enough context, so we'll just get into the... Oh, sorry. I forgot Dr. Ahmad, who traveled the farthest, Dr. Ahmad Kumar. Dr. Ahmad is the Deputy Director General of the Unique Identification Authority of India. Dr. Ahmad, I apologize. So thank you, everyone. We'll jump straight into it. Minister Paula, you just recently chaired the ITU World Telecommunications Development Conference. In that conference, there were a couple of commitments made around connecting the unconnected. Could you help, for the audience that's in the room, help us understand the challenge as we connect the close to 3 million people who are still unconnected, and also what Rwanda has been doing about bridging the digital divide so far?
Thank you very much, Tessie. And Prime Minister Andrew Holness, I must say, as you went through your speech, I scrapped all my notes because you literally touched the key things that would set the stage for this conversation that we are having today. But just going quickly back to the question that I've been asked, just 2 weeks ago, actually, well, it's a week ago, but we had it for 2 weeks, we hosted the very first World Telecommunication Development Conference here in Rwanda, and it was the first in Africa. So for Rwanda, there's been many firsts this month, from the first WTDC to the first CHOGM on the continent. But again, what came out of 2 weeks of deliberations and conversations was really what we call the Kigali Action Plan. And what's enshrined in the Kigali Action Plan was a commitment to connect the remaining unconnected. And even if I pull statistics that probably everyone in the room is familiar with, we talk about the 2.9 billion people that remain unconnected today in the whole world. But majority of those are in Africa, are in developing countries. And what does that really mean? As we went through 2 weeks of not just coming up with an action plan that looks at tangible ways how we can close on that gap, but also an action plan that came up with commitments. We launched a Partner to Connect initiative where governments, private sectors, civil society, the youth came together to really make concrete commitments on what they're going to do differently over the next 4 years to close on this gap of people that remain unconnected. But what is very interesting about all of this is when you look at it, the 1/3 of the global population that remains unconnected is the most difficult for many governments to be able to connect. They remain largely the ones that whose digital literacy skills are very low. They remain those whose purchasing power is very low. And so when we talk about affordability, whether it's affordability for devices, affordability for the telecommunication services, it's still within out of their reach if you have to consider the things that are considered basic needs. But what is also alarming about the 2.9 billion that remain unconnected now, this is 2022. In 2021, 2020, we were talking about 3 billion people that were unconnected. And so a year later, or over a year later, you're talking about 2.9. So in essence, if we're going to go at the speed at which we're going at, we're talking about another 29 years before we connect the remaining 2.9 billion. Yet, we all recognize that this past year has been what we call the COVID connectivity boost because of the COVID-19, operators scaling up their infrastructure, everyone going digital, whether it's organizations. But then when you look at the gap that we have, I don't think we can afford to wait for the next generation to close on this gap. And so as we go through this Kigali Action Plan, but also as we link it to the conversations that we're having today here at the CHOGM Business Forum, the key thing for us to really think about is twofold when we think about the digital divide. There's the digital divide in terms of places that remain unconnected, where you wouldn't find any minimum piece of infrastructure coverage lacks largely, but there's also the other statistic of people who live in areas of coverage and still are not able to use it. And so here we'll be talking about what is it going to take to build the digital literacy skills? What is it going to take to drive affordability of devices, affordability of these services? What is it going to take to drive content? And when you talk about content, you'll think from educational apps, financial inclusion. All of these things are going to rely heavily on the investments that we make in the digital infrastructure. So, and Tessie, maybe just to wrap up on this, I think what we're looking at is closing both the coverage gap that exists. I think for many countries when you look at the statistics of population coverage versus geographic coverage, there's still a distinct gap to cater for. But I think what is more emergent for all of us as we sit here in the room and debate on this is the usage gap that will be going forward. And I wanted to close on just a few examples of what Rwanda has done we have put in place a digital ambassadors program where we have digital ambassadors in different parts of the country. They'll go out and train citizens, but also what we're doing is to mainstream digital literacy within the education system, because majority of our people are the youth and they're in some form of education establishment. When it comes to devices, and you'll be seeing a lot of this happening over the next few years, it's the work that we're doing with the different operators we have within the economy, MTN, Airtel, the different companies that rely heavily on making sure that a citizen has a device and can access their services, to really roll out affordable device financing mechanisms that make it easy for a citizen to afford a smart device, but at the same time be able to access the information and services that we're providing them with. And not withholding, I think what's more important is the policies and regulations we are putting in place to support all the operators to drive wide-scale deployment of infrastructure, but also adoption at the same time. And I'm sure all of these are things that are definitely happening in different countries. The key thing is to understand what are those things that are going to allow us to drive this adoption as fast as possible, because 29 years is probably not acceptable for anyone.
Thank you, Honorable Minister. You've talked about there's the coverage and there's the adoption problem. And maybe we'll start with the coverage. And Jonas, I'm going to come to you. The one that's unconnected is the most difficult to reach, and we don't want to wait 29 years. So what needs to be done to help you, as someone who's building this infrastructure, and we have many, what needs to be done to help you connect these people?
Excellent. I'm not so sure who the you is, so I'll answer it in multiple ways. So if the you is government, we need licenses everywhere we go, quickly, as opposed to the turnaround time of a year to 2 years that we're getting into, especially when you get to the less connected countries, the harder it becomes to get the necessary telecom licenses. We need access to infrastructure, that is electricity poles, railroads. We're now doing a lot of railroad deployment. It deploys really quickly. It goes at a rate of 2 kilometers per hour for fiber. We need access to the rivers that are navigable. Then we really need better coordination on the infrastructure development, which affects the reliability and outages a lot. And also on the regulatory side, we need tariffs for data infrastructure sharing. So the regulator, it's been about more than at least 10 years in some countries, 15 years since they came out with rates for co-location of towers among operators. They governed interconnect rates for calling right away, but for some reason it's even 10, 15 years after fiber has arrived on the continent, we still don't have a regulatory framework where you have caps on dark fiber sharing, duct sharing, pole sharing, and so forth. Lastly, I think if I answer the question from the perspective of capital and operators, I think one of the things that really goes unnoticed in this industry is that out of the full value chain, from the mobile handset manufacturer to the telco network provider to the OTTs of the likes of Facebook and Google, the one that has the largest CapEx need, the need for cash and the need for CapEx investment, is the mobile network operator. But somehow that's the mobile network operator only gets 8 to 10 times EBITDA on the evaluations, while the OTTs are getting 40 to 50 times EBITDA, and the tower cos and the data centers that get money from us are getting 20, 25 times EBITDA. So I think us as operators also, and from a capital market, we really need to fix that issue, especially because we're also the ones expected to pay dividends. People in this room, I think, would be shocked to hear that the likes of Google and Facebook have never paid a single dollar in dividend since they were incorporated. while at the same time they have very little, they have a very capex-light business. So I think these are the kind of issues we need to fix to really get down dirty and then connect the 2.9 billion really quickly. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonas. And we're going to come to, I see a lot of heads shaking, so we'll come to that just in a minute. But there's another kind of infrastructure we need, and this is the digital infrastructure. So Dr. Mod, I just want you to speak about Aadhaar, which you told me earlier actually means foundation, India's digital ID system, and the role Aadhaar has had on bridging the digital divide in India.
So first of all, I thank RDB for getting me here, and I'm so happy to be here and amazed to see the progress of this country. And I also thank Right Honorable Prime Minister of Jamaica, who made my job easier by stating the importance of digital identity in bridging the digital divide. I would say in a physical setup, when you are in a physical world, to do any transaction, any business, you get the trust by some introduction, by some connection, or if there is a stranger, you are dealing with a stranger, you see the stranger's physical identity like a driving license, voter ID card, a ration card. But when your country wants to become digital, you want your economy to become digital, where do you get that trust from? And that trust comes from digital identity. And it is impossible to become a digital country or a digital economy without laying the foundations of digital identity to every citizen of your country. And that is why in India, the digital identity we have named as Aadhaar. The English of Aadhaar is foundation. And we recognize in India that digital identity is the foundation on which every digital platform is built, whether it is fintech, agri-tech, health tech, edu-tech, direct benefit transfer to the citizens, the government schemes. Now, what is Aadhaar? What is the digital identity as we have created in India? Basically, it is a 12-digit random number assigned to every resident of India, and it has 4 demographic attributes: name, date of birth, gender, and address. 3 biometric attributes: iris, fingerprints, and face, and 2 contact attributes, which are optional, which is email and mobile. And these 9 together, tagged with the number, we have given to all 1.3 billion residents of India in last 10 years. And along with this, we have this facility of authentication anytime, anywhere, 24/7. And every day, 6 million queries hit our servers. 6 million times every day, we tell a service provider that X is X. If X is claiming to be X, X sends her fingerprint and number, we match with our database, and in milliseconds, we give yes or no. I think that is the basic thing which we realized long back in 2009 when we started this. And coming to the issue of digital divide, it's a great leveler because the richest person in India, a multi-billionaire, has the same Aadhaar cards, similar 12-digit number as a poor resident living in a remote village in India has. And that's a great leveler, and that is a tool and a big step towards bridging the digital divide. So what have we gained by providing this kind of infrastructure to every resident? So what we have gained in terms of government schemes, India is a big country. We have 30 state governments, roughly 1,000 government schemes. And in that, we transfer money. So earlier, there used to be duplicate beneficiaries, ghost beneficiaries, fake beneficiaries. But now with this, a citizen can take advantage only once and nobody is left out. And in this way, we have saved already roughly $30 billion in the past few years. And apart from that, we have enabled fintech. We have created a startup ecosystem. In fintech, roughly 50 billion transactions take place in India every year. Last year, the volume and the money which was transacted using fintech in India payments was $1 trillion in 1 year. So that is the power. We invested just $2 billion in creating this system. And the advantages, I think, if you see all the intangible advantages, it would be upwards of some $50 billion. No other infrastructure, no other investment in public system can give you that kind of return. And that is why I say that every country which is trying to move towards a digital country, they must realize that the first step, the foundation, is creating a digital identity. And the decisions which you take now, so the project may be implemented in 2, 3 years, 5 years, but the decisions you take affect, they benefit you or they haunt you for the next 100 years. Because once a digital identity is given to a citizen, it stays with that citizen for the lifetime. And that is why you need to be very cautious. And I want to make use of this opportunity of this forum, that India is more than willing, more than happy to partner with any other Commonwealth country or any other African country who wants to take that journey. Because we know that when we share, when we partner, whatever we share with you, we will learn much more from you, because your system will be definitely, because it is being built later, so it will be a more advanced technology, it will be having more better features, it will have learnings from all other systems. Like when we implemented our system, we learned from the previous systems and tried to build upon that. So I think this is all now, and I'll keep sharing it as we discuss.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmad. Thank you. I'd like now to turn to some of to the adoption question, and maybe we'll start with Rolf. MTN has been, you've transformed industries, not just telcos, but financial industries. You've enabled industries like off-grid solar. Recently, you made a commitment to financially include 100 million people and 2 million SMEs by the end of 2025. That's in 3 years. But we know that affordability and digital literacy remain a challenge. So how is MTN planning to address those challenges as you look to meet these ambitious targets by 2025?
No, thanks very much, and great opportunity to be on this platform. And just to share from an MTN perspective our own lessons and learnings with regards to the challenges of meeting the digital divide and actually closing it. Minister Paula, I think, is absolutely correct in her mathematics, in that if we go at the pace that we're going, it will take us a whole generation. And so we do need to think a little bit differently to how we saw the problem even a year ago, because COVID and the situation that we find ourselves in more broadly across the globe requires us to think, a little bit innovatively and differently from where we've come from. But I want to start off by, tackling your question from the point of view of what the minister spoke about, is that what we're facing today with the digital divide is essentially two big problems. And unless we become quite granular around how we tackle the problems, we'll have talk shops for another generation. So if we start with the first part, which is the unconnected. The issue on the unconnected is really the problem of the last mile. Network operators such as ourselves and others, have done quite a bit over the last 25 to 30 years to be able to roll out different technologies, firstly 1G, 2G, 3G, 4G, and today we're talking about 5G. But what COVID showed us is that we still are missing, that last mile, so to speak. That last mile requires an operating model that is much more bringing traditional competitors to cooperate and bringing in the government sector in and creating the incentives that get us to reach that last customer in any country, that so-called last mile. The conventional approaches of setting targets to operators to reach that last mile would take us another 30 years to get there, in a way that people in the rural areas have access to education, health facilities, the police can work in remote areas, security is strong within all those areas. It's going to require a private-public approach, and companies that have traditionally competed must cooperate and with governments to really reach that last. And if that approach is taken, what might take us 30 years on that last mile is something that can take us, less than a decade, maybe even 5 years. So it requires a very different way of thinking and a regulatory regime that says we cannot leave the unconnected behind for another generation. We have to solve it like now. And the frameworks we have today are inadequate to deal with that problem now, require public and private partnerships. And companies such as MTN are very committed to that. We've set as part of our sustainability targets rural broadband coverage, and we're saying one way or the other we're going to have to fix this. And part of that thinking is going to force us to not only think about connectivity with a terrestrial mindset. Right now we've taken a very terrestrial mindset, set up towers, put fiber on the ground. But we're now seeing the low Earth orbit satellites coming into effect. And there is actually, from a MNO point of view, a sense of, well, this is not really going to change the landscape. But we know what happens with technologies. Technology is a way to kind of get to an inflection point, and all of a sudden those low Earth orbit satellites are able to, provide services reliably. And that very last mile, I don't think latency is the issue. The issue there is I just need coverage. I just need to be connected to the internet. Yes, it may take me a little bit slower than my cousin in the city. So the other issue is now needing to think both with satellite and terrestrial technologies and the combination of those to bring the unconnected into the internet and the digital economy. For those who are already covered but are still unconnected, I think the problem requires a slightly different solution. I think the first thing is handsets. In many of the markets we operate in as MTN, our customers can only afford, in dollar equivalents, $2, $3, maybe $4 to spend on services per month for telecommunications. Not just the connectivity, but also the services. But the handsets are coming at $40 to $50. Data-capable handsets that can provide the services that people in this room are very comfortable and used to. You can surf the internet, you can use productivity tools, and so forth. That phone with the memory, the storage, and all of that is going to cost you somewhere between $40 to $50. We actually need handsets that are closer to $20 and below. So yes, there are some very innovative things that operators are doing with banks around financing, handset financing, but the price has to come down. And now with the chip shortage that we've seen globally, actually this thing has moved the other way. And so we need to double down on efforts to get handsets much cheaper. Again, collaboration required, but the private sector can mobilize the capital. The other point is really around affordability. And yes, we as operators like to make a decent return on capital and to be able to pay the dividends that were said earlier on, because it's not our money, it's our shareholders' money that we're actually deploying. But what I would argue is that spectrum, the release of spectrum, particularly to enable 4G and 5G services across our markets, is a real important priority. And I know in many markets, and I know India is actually is doing its 5G auction in July. Many markets are right now quickly releasing the outstanding 4G, 5G spectrum. Spectrum in sufficient quantity and affordable quantity has the ability to radically reduce the cost of connectivity. Radically reduce. That's because if you don't have enough spectrum, you end up densifying your sites. That costs more and creates an uneconomic structure. So I would argue that the other key area around affordability is really that we have regulatory framework that is thinking very clearly about how do we enable the operators to connect as many people as possible as quickly, and have a commitment with the operators about what does the price curve need to look like so everybody can afford data. And with the right regulatory framework, the operators will bring a glide path down on affordability because they have sufficient spectrum to be able to provide. The other is services, and to your point really about, how do you accelerate adoption? There are services that are, available, but the issue that we find often is that service is not the issue, it's actually literacy. So literacy has become the other impediment to real adoption. So we do need to create services that people who are not using English as their language can actually have the confidence to engage with the internet, because they don't want to feel humiliated and embarrassed because it's not English, it's not French. The local languages. And what we're trying as an operator, as MTN, we've developed our own app called Ayoba. And the one thing that we feel passionate about, that we may not succeed ultimately, but we're going to give it a very good try, is that we're trying to tailor it for local languages. So that whole language and literacy issue is another area that needs to be tackled. The final area is really around regulatory harmony and certainty. And I think some points were made earlier on. The ability to mobilize capital to be able to close the digital divide, there is enough capital out there. Now, for the African continent, there are numbers that say we need another $100 billion to really connect everybody on this continent. Some people say the number is 400. So let's agree that somewhere between 100 and 400 billion is needed to connect. That capital can be provided by private sector largely. There is an appetite and a skill that the private sector can bring. But what the private sector cannot do is to have regulatory uncertainty, because capital providers want to know that this is an industry that's capital intensive, so it's got long payback periods. So when we understand the regulatory, so we would call upon as a private sector that more regulatory harmonization across regions, such as across Africa as a start, would make the case more compelling for investors to accelerate capital, to really close the digital divide. So those would be some of the things that we think are specifically needed to tackle this, so that the ministers fear that will take a generation, are not realized, and we're able to close it in the next 5 years.
Thank you, Ralph. Hardy, I now want to come to you. Cassava Technologies, you envision a digitally connected future for every African. We've had some of the challenges with devices, with service costs, and so on. So with that framing in mind, it would be good to hear what your experience has been so far, and how Cassava Technologies within the different groups of companies that you have in the holding company are either overcoming those challenges so that you're able to connect the digital divide. To connect the unconnected.
Great, Tessie, thank you very much. And I think it's a great forum that we have to talk about this. But I think we have spoken for a long time about the digital divide. And the unconnected are poor, they live in the rural areas, they tend to be less literate than others, they tend to be older, and regrettably they tend to be women. And I think on any one of those boxes, it's a compelling time for us to do something. And therefore, the reason why for us this vision of a digitally connected future that leaves no African behind is not just a mantra. It's really about sustainability. Every person that we leave behind is a political risk for the economy in which they live. They are a risk to the businesses that we're building. I want to go a bit granular, because what is actually missing in Africa is what we have called the Africa Missing Network. The unit economics go this way. In order to move a gigabyte of data from Marseille in France to the port of Mombasa costs us half a US cent. In order to move the same gigabyte of data from Mombasa to Nairobi costs us between 2 and 3 cents. So in order to get into our data center in Nairobi, that gigabyte is about 2.5 cents. In order to move the same gigabyte from our data center in Nairobi, on Mombasa Road, for those who know Nairobi, into Umoja, which is 7 kilometers away, costs us $1.20. So it's not the first mile, it's not the second mile. The cost really is on the middle mile and the last mile. And that's the missing network that is keeping a lot of people, certainly on the African continent, still unconnected, even though they may be covered. So we have made it our mission at Cassava Technologies to bring down the cost of access on that middle mile and the last mile to between 10 and 20 cents. Because in Africa today, people are paying $6.73, the people that are sitting in here, per gigabyte on average. In India, they're paying $1.83. In most cases, under $1 per gigabyte. If you look at the intensity of this cost based on what the average African earns, $6.73 is probably 40 to 50% of the household GDP in most of our African cities, especially in the informal settlements. So unless we get to that point where we say, what are the unit economics that gets us to get people to actually be connected? And all the things that my colleagues spoke about are valid. The digital identity, the issue of power. We can't talk about connectivity without dealing with power. And that's why for us, and Ralph will bear me out, the second largest power company in Africa, in every African country, that nobody knows about, is the telco. There are 60 million diesel generators on the African continent. The majority of them, they are sitting within our networks. So we recognized years ago that unless we dealt with the power issue, Africa has got abundant sunshine, and that's why we've got a company within the group called Distributed Power Africa that really deals with access to power and reliability of power and the cost of power. So that's a basic building block. We can bring the network in, but even if the device is cheap and the person can't recharge it, they are still going to remain unconnected. So in Africa, we can't really talk about bridging the digital divide without solving the power challenge. The cost issue, just going back to the to unity economics, I like what Ralph said about getting out of the terrestrial thinking and starting to look at what made us leapfrog in Africa in 1994-95. It was abandoning what was then the incumbent infrastructure of copper and leapfrogging to wireless. And I think that the way we will deal with this last mile is really to be willing to abandon what has worked over the last 25 to 30 years. Adopt new technologies like wireless optics, which we have deployed wireless for the first time. Kinshasa and Brazzaville is connected with a broadband connection because we put 2 wireless optical terminals across the river, and we can beam 100 gigabytes of connectivity over that 7-kilometer stretch of the river. So it is that kind of thinking in order to deal with the middle mile. But we also then have to recognize that people interact as economic entities. And I'm sure that my colleague here will talk about fintech. And for us, fintech has really been about the previously excluded. Those that were previously told they cannot afford banking. And so nowadays, the joke that I make to bankers is actually Africans can't afford to have a bank account. It's too expensive. You know, we don't need the bank account. We're willing to leapfrog away from the bank account and go straight to using other technologies in order for us to be able to pay and get paid. So really across the value chain, what we are doing at Cassava Technologies, we've got 110,000 kilometers of fiber from Cape Town to Cairo, from Mombasa to Rwanda, from Port Sudan to Lagos. There isn't any reason why any data should leave the African continent. We can collaborate with MTN, with Airtel, with Orange, in order to make sure that we reduce the costs of the fiber broadband infrastructure. We have been able to then deal with metro fiber networks in order to get the metros to be ringed up, to be able to bring fiber to the home, to be able to make sure that once we are in a community, we can use Wi-Fi technologies in order to make sure that people can access data at under 20 cents a gigabyte, which is where it is affordable. So it's really looking at the whole value chain in order for us to be able to deal with this digital divide. From digital identity to power, to the backbone, to the middle mile, to fintech, and then finally to the literacy. Because if you remember what I said about the 5 things, if the person is not literate, we need applications that speak African. Because the people that are unconnected, they are poor, they are rural, they are older, they are less literate. But guess what? They are very literate in Kinyarwanda. They are very literate in Swahili. They are very literate in Amharic. So let's make sure that the applications that we are building as providers can truly speak African so that we can bring these people into the economic mainstream. Thank you.
Thank you, Hardy. Dr. Valentine, the Right Honorable Prime Minister mentioned that we need to start seeing ourselves as innovators, not just consumers. You're a serial fintech entrepreneur, starting as early as 2003 before we even coined the word fintech on the continent. And I'm sure back then the infrastructure wasn't where it is today. Mobile phones were not as universal as we see today. So we have some entrepreneurs in the room today. What advice do you have for startups who are building for the digital divide and having to now transform these non-consumers into consumers?
No, thank you very much, Essie. The fact of the matter is, irrespective of how beautiful your application is or the solution you're developing is, you need to ask yourself the right questions. When we started, we are in a country whereby 80 to 90% are unbanked. And they don't trust the bank. They don't want to do transactions with the bank. So the idea is, how do you move these people from where they are to the next? We asked ourselves some serious questions, and what we realized first is that indeed you need to create a solution that truly offers them value, because people gravitate always to that where they can see value. I had an experience. I was invited by USAID to the northern part of Nigeria, to Kano, and to speak to some farmers, illiterate farmers. One of them was about 70 years old. Well, I came and I spoke to them, and I told them about how they can do transactions using mobile. This was in 2004. After all the presentation, I can't hear them, they can hear me, but we have an interpreter. The only way that I understood that they hear me, they got what I was saying, is that the man came, by a 70-year-old man, put his hand in his big, you know what they call babariga, that's the big gown that they wear, took out 100,000 and said, put it on my phone. Well, that wasn't exactly what I was expecting, right? And he said, young man, if what you're saying is true, it simply means that I can leave Sokoto and come to Kano without cash? I said, yes. And he said, why? I said, because some of their mates, colleagues, will leave Sokoto to come to Dawano market in Kano. Some of them get attacked, some even get killed. So it means I can leave my money there and transact with it there. I said, yes, sir. There and then, out of the 62 of them, 50 of these old illiterate farmers signed up in that place and we set up the first agent bank within the market using a pharmacy. There was a need. They saw the value it will bring. So you as a fintech entrepreneur or as an entrepreneur, obviously what you need to think about is what value am I bringing? That's number one. What value are you creating? And the other thing we found out within SIM contest is the use cases. Because we need to be able to address the need of the individual. And that is, if they know that this will give them this value or this provide a solution, you don't really need to drive them so much to come into the bracket of the digitally included. The idea is that you have to give them a solution. So we had our own tagline then, secure, convenient, and cost-effective. Want to make your transaction secure, want to make it cost, both for the individual, both for the businesses, and also for the government. We had a challenge where government have issues with collecting VAT. So what do? Instead of them chasing after everyone to collect VAT, it simply means they can actually use the public to pursue that. So you create a platform that enables the public to be your policeman. Now, so I'm talking to, so because advising those who are into creating those kind of solutions. So your solution must indeed truly offer value. So what we saw in 2003 was simply that if you can help me reduce my cost and show me the true value, they'll sign up. And that's why e-trans have been successful in doing that. And most of the thing we have done is making sure that end user sees real value for what is. It's not just how nice your app is or how nice the business model is, but what value are you creating? What solution, what problems are you solving? And in Africa, there's so many. There are so many things that you out there that are trying to develop. You can look within your community how to solve those problems. We have situations whereby universities, one of the biggest challenges is just simple reconciliation of student payments. And they were doing that all manually, and they're doing it through a card. It was horrendous. We came out with a solution that would basically digitize it end to end. Recently, we started the issues of allowing SMEs you can put your invoice into a platform and becomes available to the rest of the continent. What does that mean? It solves the problem of you just thinking just locally within your own environment. You can actually get funding, not just within, say, Uganda. You can get funding for whatever it is you want to do all across the continent. So we'll build a solution that enables you as an SME, you have done a job maybe for MTN Uganda, and they're owing you $50,000. You can't wait for 30 days. You can't wait for 60 days. You want your money so you can actually turn it over again. Now, if you depend only on the Ugandan economy or investors, it's a problem. So what do? Can we open it across to all investors across Africa? Sitting on the board of African Bank PAPS, we created a solution that enables you can put those information in, becomes available to investors across Africa, and then they can pay, it may be an investor in Ghana, so you will release in cedis, and you get your money in shillings in Uganda, no dollar involved. Now, so what am I saying? In Africa, where we are, there are a lot of issues, problems that require solutions, and we can do it. And I believe that's why most of us are here today. You know, we need to look at the things that are happening in the environment. What kind of solutions that we can use? Either it is, you know, even for the markets that we have. We don't have the big supermarket, but we have local markets. How can we solve the problems that affect this SME, the small market woman that is buying things from the distributors? You know? And I think those are the things that I see, and that's what helped us, moved up our people, because we solved certain problems. We created values that they can see, they can touch, and that's really what it is. So that would be my advice to any fintech developer, any entrepreneur. Look out for those issues within that environment that will reduce costs, that will make it more convenient, and also will make it secure. That way you can be sure that you don't have to push people, they will come. Today, e-trans are people just, you know, various businesses, the banks, they come with their solutions to us because they know that we can help them solve the problem. And I think that's what we did, and that's how e-trans has been successful to this day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thomas, I now want to come to you. There's been a lot of discussion around policy and regulation, and I know this is your area, even at an international level. So, you know, what needs to be done at both the policy and the regulatory level, you know, at different parts of the value chain, so that for affordable and universal coverage?
So thank you very much, Tessie, and thank you. And it's a great honor to speak after so many great insights from the practitioners from the ground, and also trying to, you know, some of what I'll say probably repeat that. And also, first of all, before speaking, I want to thank again Minister Paul Ingabire for, you know, being here today, but then hosting great event for the last 2 weeks. You know, so I feel I'm already living in Rwanda. This is my 3rd week here, but it's definitely a great time, and I think we're progressing a lot here on digital divide, not only in Africa but globally in the last 3 weeks. So, so from my perspective, a few points. First is maybe bad news for policymakers and regulators in telecoms area, that the last few years shown that a lot of things don't depend on those people, you know, on us. And, you know, so we had the COVID-19 times seen a lot of investments in digital infrastructure, and indeed it wasn't always driven by policy and regulatory environment. It was driven by a lot of cheap money floating around with very uncertain market with low interest rates. And now it all changed, you know, or risking to change, you know, with Bain showing that actually in the first quarter of 2022, the telecoms deal making halved, you know, compared to the last year. So, and that's, you know, not because telecom policy changed. We are witnessing geopolitical situation and local political uncertainties that also impact that the investment environment in digital infrastructure. And I think that's why it's so enlightening and inspiring to see here the most honorable Prime Minister of Jamaica sitting here with us and addressing us, because it's not only clearly, sometimes some of those things are beyond the pay grade of telecom ministers and regulators and needs the attention of the government, and it's great to see that here, you know, they're ensuring the stable macroeconomic environment, the stable political environment, you know, for investments in the countries. The second is, you know, it's interesting, it's an important trend for the last years is the coming back of policy into telecoms. Because let's say 20 years or more ago, when I started my career in telecoms regulation, policy basically retreated. You know, there was setting up the regulatory frameworks, giving the clear rules to regulators, and regulators just got on with that. You know, most of the countries privatize telecom players, you know, and allow them to work within the rules system. That's not anymore the case, you know. We see a lot of investments from public sector coming back in telecoms, you know, with, you know, US just announcing $65 billion investment in telecoms infrastructure, broadband infrastructure, different countries around the world doing the same thing. And Ralph mentioned public-private partnerships. And, you know, you see those examples with the shared rural network projects from UK to New Zealand to elsewhere in the world, you know, with governments coming with a pot of money, with the operators committing to roll out targets, and then, with moving away from individual coverage targets to more countrywide coverage targets, that operators jointly agree. And that, of course, means that political leadership of the policymakers is very important to make it happen. And I think that's, and to move away from just, hands-off regulatory approach. Of course, a third point is, regulation, of course, still is important. Even if you have this big political drive, you need certain guardrails, and you need certain basics to have it right. And I think, just echoing what Jonas said about access to, let's say, passive infrastructure and clear rules on that, and in Europe, they a few years ago adopted a broadband cost reduction directive, it was really a big push to that, It seems like a very mundane thing, how do you access the duct infrastructure? How do you access the in-building infrastructure? They seem like very mundane things when you talk about such big things about digital divide, but they matter a lot, How you auction spectrum, and we discussed these things matter a lot, and how much, what is the spectrum cost? What is the certainty of wholesale regulation matters a lot. So I think regulators still have that role to play. One thing also, and I think we mentioned here before, it's not only about expanding digital infrastructure, it's about use of it. And, now the GSMA statistics say that, out of unconnected people, about 90% of them are actually covered, so mentioning some of the points that, and that means we still need to, the big challenge is to increase the use. Within that, and again, it was mentioned before, there are certain vulnerable groups, and, including, we still have gender divide, and regretfully, last report of GSMA showed that gender divide is a persistent problem, rather than retreating, it's still there, and it's even more there, back there. So we still need to deal with that, and that's, of course, the questions around affordability, the questions around skills, and other questions that policymakers need to deal with. The last point maybe I want to bring into this discussion, and sometimes, we focus on digital divide so much we again forget that we live in the bigger world, what they could call green divide, So we recently did a study about telecommunications company sustainability practices. And we saw that, around 80% of companies around the world say it's important. They report that in their reports and annual reports. However, only 36% of them, or the total companies, have actually tangible targets based on scientific-based target framework. And when you look outside, when you look at some regions, it's even less. You can clearly see the regional divide in that. So I think maybe a bit of a different point on a perspective to other people. But I think while we bridge the digital divide, we need to remember not to allow other issues and other challenges to accumulate, and understand that we need to do that in a sustainable way as well. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. I know we don't have a lot of time left, but I think we'll just, one more question that I would put for the group. You've all talked about how it's important that we become granular, right? We stop talking at the high level and we get into the granular details around how we solve this problem. And so to conclude, I would ask each and every one of you, and you can pick who your ask goes to, whether it's policymakers, regulators, the capital providers, entrepreneurs, about what's one ask you have for them when it comes to closing the digital divide. So be as granular as you can, but obviously granular, what's that one important ask that you would have for them to close the digital divide? Minister Paula, I'll start with you.
Thank you. Thanks, Stacey. And perhaps as we close off on the first round of questions, one of my key takeaways, even for perhaps also for everyone in the room, would be, I'm sure there are people who are sitting in the room and are wondering, okay, we've had similar panels, what is it that is going to be done differently? And perhaps that was why I said the 1/3 that remains unconnected is probably the most difficult to connect, which is why we still have about 2.9 billion. And what that says is that all the policies, all the regulations, all the business models and the financing that has worked to connect 4.9 billion perhaps is not going to be a good fit to connect the remaining 2.9. And so when we talk about disruption, it's going to require that even us as policymakers, we change how we are doing things, because clearly the same policies that we're using and regulations, if they haven't helped us to connect these that remain unconnected, it's already a question mark for us, and we should be saying what should we be doing differently for the partnerships that are for the models of rolling out more infrastructure, driving adoption. So I think that's the key takeaway, and even as we sit in this room, it's what are we going to be doing differently? Because I don't think just scaling what has already been done is actually going to give us the much needed traction that we need to close the gap on those that remain unconnected. But quickly to your question, and since I had insight into what the second question could have been, had we had enough time, what's my one single ask? I think it's agility in all areas. And when I say it, I think about ourselves as policymakers and regulators, first to say how agile and responsive can we be if we want to encourage the investments. I believe there was one of the speakers who spoke earlier and said, if we need a license and it's going to take you 1 year to give me the license and you need me to deploy the infrastructure in 3 months, it's not a fair ask. And so if I'm going to ask you, and I see the CEO of MTN is smiling, if I'm going to ask her in the next 1 year to close all the geographic coverage gaps, then I must also be open to supporting with the different regulations that are needed or policies. And so I think it's agility. And I think it's one thing we definitely struggle with as policymakers and regulators, because the rate at which technology evolves is very fast, that sometimes policies and regulations are playing catch up. But I think once we are very open-minded and agile and responsive to what is left, I think it makes sense. So finally, as I talk about agility, I think it's the use of data. And I wanted to link it to that question that you never got to ask. We all have lots of data, whether it's in our organizations, as public sector institutions, as private sector. How much of that are we using to drive? I say this because as we started our journey on how do we ensure that the vision that we've set out to be a cashless economy happens, because we had already seen in 2 years' time, we had 15 times growth of digital financial transactions, and we started to say, what can we do differently? What we realized very quickly in using data was that one size fits all interventions may never work. So what could work to drive cashless in the SMEs and retail industry inevitably was not going to work when we went to agriculture, because the majority of our farmers don't have a bank account, don't have a basic phone. We're not even talking about a smartphone. So if you're going to drive digital financial inclusion, the kind of strategies that you're going to deploy out there were going to be different. And this data that we used is what was able to allow us to look at the spectrum of interventions that we need to do to close on the cashless gap.
Thank you, Honorable Minister. We've been told we have 5 minutes, so but Ralph, you can go next, and then we'll just...
Okay, in the interest of time, I mean, maybe to invert your question a little bit, I mean, from my perspective is, I think we need to be quite granular on this ask, and my sense is that what we need to commit to is, from a private sector point of view, is to say that to the policymakers and the governments, that the capital is here available to connect those who are not connected. We would just ask for a regulatory regime that provides certainty for long-term capital to invest, and we would then commit to bringing down the cost of accessing the internet on a glide path that is agreed on a multi-year basis, and you'll be surprised how quickly we move to be able to close the gap.
Thank you. I know you said one ask. I'm going to ask for 2. One, I agree with the minister. We're living in an era, and I'm going to speak as an African here, where people are sending the rover to Mars, and they can monitor what it is doing. And these people went to school with us. So agility, agility, agility. Minister, I agree with you. My second ask is on the Universal Service Fund. I think we have to stop the USF being a piggy bank for the regulator or for the government. There needs to be better governance on how the USF is managed, because it was set up in order to specifically deal with the issue. If our USFs were properly managed across Africa, I believe we can deal with 80% of the rural connectivity issues that we're dealing with. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think on my part, like what I just said a while ago, with all the infrastructure that we even have, is how well are we using it, even the ones we have. You know, and I believe that if we put solutions on the current infrastructure, we say build up, solution that actually touches the people, you'll find out that it's a lot easier to include them. Now, we can take, for example, in Nigeria in 2000, simply to get, we had a country whereby only 200,000 phones are available. MTN, Econet came into the sphere, and it took just 2 years, and we had over 2 million out of 3. So the moment you create solutions that people will need, you don't really need to begin to look out for people to, you know, to bridge the divide. The people will gravitate towards it. And I think that is what we need to, especially for entrepreneurs that are here, to begin to look at how to build more solutions, using even our current infrastructure, even as we build out.
So, thanks a lot. So, I think I would say global solidarity in bridging digital divide, because I worked with the government of Vanuatu, for example, bringing the submarine cable there first, you know, and it's very simple mathematics, you know. 1,200 kilometers to Fiji, $30,000 per kilometer, only 200,000 people to serve across all islands, you know. So whichever we try to make it work, you know, there'll still be people and places where mathematics and economics won't work, and I think we need to understand that's all our issue. I think we have positive things, you know, in the last few years. We saw G20 coming up, you know, we saw our common agenda with Secretary General Antonio Guterres saying we need to bridge the global divide. We see such programs as European Union Global Gateway Program, which pledges 300,000 for infrastructure projects around the world, and even just you know, in the last 2 weeks, you know, Partner to Connect generated pledges worth of 26 billion, you know, US. So there is a move, but I think we really need to blow on that, you know, really need to push on that, and understand that this is all of our work to bridge that digital divide to everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, so my ask is for this fictional worldwide single entity called capital, and it would be for capital to understand that it needs to support software and service entrepreneurs that either come from or have experienced the lives of the people that come from our low economic classes, which make a super majority of our population in Africa. Most of the software and service digitization business are done for people in the slums that have never spent a night in the slum, or grew up or came from that. Second ask for capital would be to help support businesses that extract value from OTTs, the likes of Google, Facebook, Amazon, and keep that value in the pipes and the telecom networks that actually give them access to make the money. And then lastly, it would be to extend what they've done on the tower model to base stations, radio access networks, to fiber, where you're segmenting the ownership of the network in a much more capital efficient way, including into a distributed franchise model ownership of a telecom network. So, you know, one thing I realized when I came into this industry was, hey, why doesn't this thing run like a McDonald's? So, and I think that would help a lot with the rural access connectivity problem. Thank you.
There is very little time, and I'll be straight to the point, just 3 simple things. One is that without digital identity, without this foundation, you cannot become a digital economy, and it is something which is not only important for any developing country, but it's very urgent also. And it is very feasible, possible to do that. We did it for roughly $1.5 per identity created, so that's number one. Second, India is very happy to partner and share with you our learnings and learn from you, and we can enter into any arrangements. And lastly, seeing is believing. Until and unless you see for yourself what creation of digital identity can mean for the growth of a country, you won't believe it. And so I would invite all of you from either from Commonwealth countries or from African countries we are very happy to host you in India and to see the system. And in fact, if you need any support, we are we can travel to your countries. And I think it is for the globe to become a digital village, a global digital village. I think all of the developing countries should have some kind of a digital identity, and internationally there should be international digital identity standards which are interoperable, so that it is very easy for a person sitting in Rwanda to do business with a person sitting in Vietnam or in India. So that's.
Thank you. And with that, we've come to a close. I'd like to ask the audience to to join me in thanking our panelists. You can thank me too. Thank you, everyone. We can now get off the stage. I'll hand back over to Diana.
Everyone, we are going for a coffee break that's specifically 15 minutes long. So we should be back in the room for the next session. The next session is a very important one, financing blue-green growth for sustainable islands. Many of you may know out of the 54 Commonwealth countries, 33 are small islands, and we'll be joined by 2 heads of state in the next session. So I encourage you, 15 minutes, and let's be back in the room thereafter. Looking forward to seeing you all again. Thank you.